So when it comes to this question of ownership, what do you think are the key issues here?
So, first of all, the notion of Bryan suggesting we're opinionated, I go back a long way with Bryan. We went to our minds together in the communications course. Forceful opinions were never his weak point. And so I hope, as well as moderating, you give us your own views as well. On the issue, first of all, in terms of holding people power, I'm going to begin simply by saying it's great to be here, and I was delighted to get a letter from UL inviting me, because this university has failed to respond at all to any correspondence from me in relation to with the libel threat against the Limerick leader, and I've called today again for that threat to be withdrawn. I think it's inappropriate, in particular, for a university like this to threaten to sue a local newspaper and personally the editor. And that's not a bad starting point, because actually calling people to power and looking at the threats to journalism means examining all of the threats. Concentration of ownership is really important, but it's concentration of power, I think, are the two words used in this. Concentration of ownership has an impact at a number of levels, and that's why we're saying let's look at all of it. It could be framed in the context of who owns the media, and that is hugely important. If you look at a map of Ireland from Antrim to Kerry, there is one dominant company, and therefore that's an issue. And there are a few others, who control information, control of information. Well, when we talk about concentration of ownership, sometimes I think that's Dennis O'Brien ringing Stephen Ray telling him what to appear in the paper tomorrow. Now, that may or may not happen. I can certainly remember Tony O'Reilly's pressman ringing, asking why we didn't use the title "Sir." But the ownership issue has a number of other components. So one of them is the issue of editorial structure. So if you decide to merge newsrooms and you appoint an editor-in-chief, that impacts on content. If you decide to slash wages and make people redundant or offer weak contracts of employment, that undermines access to the profession. It makes journalism unprofessional, unaffordable, and it has a particular impact, I think, in some cases, the issue of uncertainty in relation to the gender balance in journalism and making it very difficult. Changes in working hours and uncertainty can be a contributory factor in terms of access. Equally, in terms of concentration, in terms of if we give emphasis to market share rather than editorial resources, that means you stop covering council meetings. You don't have the resources for what John Morgan once called fresh air journalism, which is someone to cover the health board or the BEC or the courts. And there's a lot of emphasis on the early session this morning, correctly, on investigative journalism. And I think investigative journalism is important. But I think when we have that debate, we sometimes forget that what I would call bread and butter journalism is also a form of investigative journalism. Because when you stop covering the county council meeting, it means that the development plan can be debated in private. When you stop covering the courts, or you ring the court clerk or the local guard to find out what went on, you are enabling justice to be conducted in private. And much of this is happening. So when I talk about the challenges of ownership, it's about those who own the media, what priorities they set and how we look at it. If Ger Colleran was here, and I'm going to pretend to be Ger for a moment, he would say that all of this is nonsense, that he doesn't worry about the role of democracy, journalism in democracy. I've had this debate with him before, and that he actually worries about people who worry about that. Because his view is that media is controlled by the market, the people decide, and what's the bother. And if you want, and I think that is a view, and I think it's worth confronting it. My view of that, and my final point of my instruction, is that we in the media think we're special. We demand protection of our sources. We see ourselves as a right to self-regulation. With those kind of demands also comes responsibilities. And as Barry Devlin said finally in conclusion, we also think we want public service broadcasting, but we don't really know what we mean by that. And I think that from where I sit, I don't accept the characterization of other people of our public service broadcaster. The main one, there are a number, is that we need to define what it is we mean by public service broadcasting and what we're prepared to pay for.
Okay, Thank you for that, Seamus. Let me come to Tom on that, because you mentioned Ger Collar, who was to be here, but I think for other reasons just wasn't able to make it. But Tom, who's formerly in this parish, of course, very kindly agreed, and we're delighted that he did so, to take part in the discussion in Ger's place. I'm not asking you now to replicate what Ger might have shared with us, Tom. But you worked for independent newspapers for many years, so I suppose you have that in common with Ger. You're now in the UK. The sort of concerns that Seamus has raised there, do you agree with them? Do you think that things we should be worried about? Particularly, do you see this happening outside of Ireland, and for example, in your experience in Britain?
Well, again, just to thank the university, Mary and Fergal and Henry and Catherine for the invitation to come. Delighted to be here. And again, just as a preamble, if you'll allow me, I would echo Seamus's concern about the threat to the local newspaper in this city by the university. I think it's a very regrettable move that a university would threaten the right of a local newspaper to publish a story in public interest, and I would call on wiser heads to prevail. And I think there are structures around the press ombudsman that can be used if there is a grievance between both parties. And indeed, the National Union of Journalists, I'm sure, will have a role to play as well. I think spending students' fees on expensive lawyers is not the way to conduct business. And I don't think it's in anyone's interest for the Limerick leader to be threatened. But let's leave that. Yeah, I live in the UK. We had an election last year where very right-wing Tory-supporting press won the election for the Tory party. There's no debate about that. That's what happened. The mantra was that Red Ed, Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, couldn't be trusted with the economy, and the Telegraph, to a lesser extent the Times, and the other Tory-supporting press, and of course the Mail, every day for 3 weeks during the election campaign ran that story. You couldn't get away from it. And what it did was, it created an agenda. It created a narrative that Red Ed couldn't be trusted. So, we might like the Tory party, but we're stuck with them. We better elect them. And subsequently we had a landslide victory for the Tories. And that came about because of a few billionaires owning very powerful institutions, media institutions. Newsrooms or newspapers are not factories where wings are produced, and it doesn't really matter who owns them. They're vitally important for democracy. They're vitally important for the health of democracy. So we need a diversity of ownership in newsrooms. We need newspapers to tell us we're wrong, to hold our feet to the flames occasionally. We don't have to agree with what they say, but we need papers of the radical left and of the radical right. And we need papers in the middle that are centrist and sensible. We need that range. We need it in radio and we need it in broadcasting. I agree with a lot of what Seamus says about local newspapers and local radio. The big problem in Ireland is that we've had 10 years now almost of a crippling recession where the media have suffered most. We have lost an awful lot of very good journalists. I'm from Galway. The Connacht Tribune has historically been one of the best papers in the country. And a number of their very well regarded journalists have retired or have taken redundancy packages. They're not covering courts anymore in places like Clifton. So if you want to know what's happening in Clifton now, you can't. Sorry, move to somewhere else. Because the local paper doesn't cover Clifton. If you want to know what's happening in rural Ireland, in many cases, it's very difficult to find out because those stories just aren't being covered because newsrooms don't have the resources to cover. That isn't necessarily an issue about ownership, but it's part of, I think it's part of the issue. So for me, journalism fundamentally has a very important role to play in democracy. Ownership and concentration of power are key issues for, I think, this morning's debate. But also, and I'm talking about this afternoon, how we're going to fund journalism. Ownership doesn't have to be by private marketeers, by billionaires who can afford to buy and sell on the stock exchange the assets of newspapers or media organisations. And there are other models, and there are public ownership models, there's philanthropy, and there's social ownership. And we haven't seen much of that in Ireland yet, but maybe it's time to start talking about those things. You know, ownership doesn't have to be rich men, and it is men, controlling what we read and hear and what we listen. And there are other kinds of models that exist. ProPublica in the US, and much closer to home, my own university, we now run in City, we run the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is a not-for-profit organisation that does journalism, and we give it away for free.
Okay.
Yeah, that's me.
All right. Well, I'm sure you have more, but that's
well, for now, that's me.
That's me. Okay. All right. Thank you, Tom. I mean, I'd particularly like to pick up some of your ideas and maybe a social ownership, different models, and we can talk about that. But let's come to Gillian, because Gillian, you're the journalistic practitioner on the panel, if I can describe you as that. You're head of news at Live 95, which I think is part of the UTV group in Ireland, which is a substantial media organisation on this island. What do you think are the issues for people like yourself, journalists, working journalists, in terms of this issue of ownership and pluralism and diversity?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm working for one of the radio stations that's owned by what's now known as the Wireless Group, which has just recently changed its name. It was the UTV Media Group, but since the buyout by ITV, it used to obviously be connected to the UTV, the television station section as well. They've sold that off to ITV, and now it's just a group of radio stations, and it didn't make sense to have TV in the name, so the name has been changed. Sometimes you can have an independent ownership that might have more interference in a news editor's role than you would from a big conglomerate. I can only speak from personal experience. As a news editor, I have never been told not to run or to run a story by ownership of the radio station. I have heard stories of others who've been told or urged one way or another on what stories they might choose to run, and it's not necessarily by these big media groups. Sometimes local ownerships have more interests in the local area. I think some of the challenges, though, are one thing that did happen with the Wireless Group when we were still in TV Media was our national and international service was for a time run by ourselves, but when UTV Ireland radio station was set up, a lot of the journalists from that group moved to UTV Ireland and weren't able to provide the service for the radio stations anymore, and a decision was made then to buy that service from News Talk, which is obviously a Communicore radio station. So now we have a situation where we have Wireless Group radio stations running we run our own local news service, our own news reporters will cover our news, but we're also buying in the national service for News Talk. So it does mean there is more of a concentration, the same news being produced on lots of different radio stations, which presents certain challenges, but there are also opportunities in that as well, because for a long time independent radio stations were faced with the big competitors of RTE. For example, politicians or heads of unions or spokespeople, they wanted to go to RTE when they were top of the news. They weren't interested in the independent radio sector. Whereas when you can present yourselves as a group and saying, look, together, all these local radio stations actually have more listeners than Radio 1, which was something we could not do as independents. You know, you're just going as a Limerick local radio station, they don't see it the same way, but when you can get that message across and you can work together in a group, and that has happened despite the fact that it's a competitive environment. Obviously Limerick's Live 95 FM isn't competing with LMFM up north, isn't competing with Galway Bay, because we have different audiences. So if we could group together on certain issues, other things that we've done in the independent sector is approach some groups, for example the Gardaí, to try and help on communication, make our issues known, where we need some cooperation in terms of news gathering and where we can help them in putting out some of their messages as well. That is much easier done when you group together. In terms of just some of the points that were made as well by the coverage of events, 20 years working in the business, I'm glad to say that I we still cover all our county council meetings, we still cover the courts. I would agree with Seamus and Tom that that is extremely important. I think economic realities are what put a lot more pressure on us than who is owning us, in my own personal experience. But I would like to see that that continues. I think it's very important. I also do think, though, that perception is important in terms of the public and their interaction with their media, in particular with their local media. I do know that there would have been a perception when Limerick's 595 FM was bought by UTV, the local perception might have been that there would have been some kind of Northern Ireland influence. I have recall listeners ringing up saying, oh, we didn't run this story because we're owned by that Protestant UTV company, you know. You never mention the fact that the Pope held a mass in the Philippines, which is, you know, just farcical. But that perception is out there, or was out there. I don't know will that change now that we have a different name, now that we're the wireless group and we're solely a group of radio stations in the Republic. Sorry, there is one in the north, is U105. Or because it is important, that perception, because the relationship between the people that we broadcast to and us is extremely important, because we need the public to interact with us. We don't have, I don't think any media has the resources to investigate anything without the public feeling that, you know what, I'll ring the local radio station and let them know that this is happening. We need people to believe that we are interested in covering our local news, and that that's what is our priority, and that they have an ownership as well over their local media.
Okay, Gillian, we've heard a number of broad issues raised so far. The question of the trust, confidence people have in a news organisation, the commercial environment that media organisations have operated in recent years, paying conditions within the media workplace. So Henry, this question of ownership, does it matter? And if so, why?
Yeah, well, obviously it's very important, because the media we can't treat as a normal commodity. I mean, Seamus mentioned there they see themselves as special, but it is in a lot of ways, because media creates realities, creates ideologies, creates frames, sets agendas, and really about the way we think about things. I mean, the water charges discussion later will be a lot about this. And the kind of ideologies that we see in the media, they're also part of the whole institutional framework. To give a quick example, independent news and media have 40% of the newspaper market. Dennis O'Brien owns nearly 30% of that, and then Communicorp used to own about 25% of the radio market, but now, as Gillian was saying, it's coming in more. However, when their merger happened, because under the regulatory framework is done in a business sense, a marketing sense, they're seen as separate markets. Therefore, because they're separate markets, there was no issue. But they didn't look at it politically. The political sense wasn't thought about it. And Roddy Flynn talked about this before. He's the person who's been doing the research you were talking about. And as he put it, that some of the major difficulty with the current regulations is its economist orientation, and its unwillingness to see the media as a political issue. It's a political issue, it's not a market issue. And this is a problem with the deep ideology in Ireland, which is replicated in the media, by the media, that everything is about markets. It's all about markets. So ownership is hugely important. So these things that we take as a natural, ordinary thing, that of course everything should be private, of course everything is about markets, and competition is about separating different advertising regimes, where it's actually far, far more important. Another thing I'd like to talk a little bit about as well is the monopolisation of distribution of news. Now, where monopolisation is a normal process in capitalism, the way markets work, etc., bigger things get bigger and bigger. What we're seeing now, which is a huge thing, is the distribution. We could just do a quick experiment here. How many people get their news from a smartphone? Hands up. Okay, everybody. Everybody practically gets their news from their smartphone. So who controls the smartphone? Now, Reuters have been doing studies on this every year, and they found in 2014, 39% of people were using smartphones. 1 year later, that had gone up to 46%. Now, who's controlling the smartphones? Who's controlling that distribution? Anyone want to take a guess? Where are you getting your news? Where is it coming from?
Reddit.
Facebook. 35% of respondents use Facebook for news. In the United States, Pew did research and they said that 40% of their respondents said Facebook was their main news source. So Facebook is distributing the news. And if it's not Facebook, it's Google, it's whichever. Now, how does Facebook decide which ones get shared, which ones don't get shared, etc.? There's all these opaque algorithms now. Facebook, of course, have other issues with taxation, etc. So you have this huge other side of ownership, which is all around distribution and new models of distribution. Now, Gemma talked about the positive end of this. There's a way of getting out there, and you can get stuff online very easily. However, getting stuff online doesn't necessarily mean people will read it, because this is where the algorithms kick in. We also have the idea of these kind of echo chambers, where you're only seeing these, if you're a left-winger, you'll only see friends posting, so you'll have a left-wing echo chamber, the same on the right. And this means it's much harder to break into the mainstream. So I think this is a huge issue that we'll be talking about in one of the panels later. So ownership, we have to think about as well. So you have to think about production and institutional issues such as pay and conditions. We also have to think about distribution, because that's wildly changing around us all the time. So.
Okay, can I just on this question, just to bring the focus down to the context on which media ownership takes place, the law in relation to this, because you mentioned competition law, and there are competition laws which restrict concentration of ownership. Now, I think one of the issues you've raised, Seamus, is that can't be applied retrospectively, because some of those laws have come in more recently.
We believe it can.
You believe it can?
Yeah. Well, I very seldom find myself on the same side as Michael McDougall. But he actually, when just very briefly to rewind, to say that this isn't a new issue. The first time that the National Union of Journalists raised the issue of concentrated ownership was in 1973, when the then FOC, the Independent, John Bryan, met someone who couldn't be far more removed from politically than Michael McDougall, and that was Justin Keating, who would be a well-known radical Marxist, himself a former journalist. And he said, nothing will be done with this, because no politician will take on a newspaper, powerful men who own newspapers. Echoing the old adage that never argue the man who buys the ink by the bar. Now, the Competition Authority, there was a review conducted by the Commission which said that there should be a change, and that instead of just looking at it as a market share issue, that there are editorial factors which should be considered. So Alex White, after about 3 years, decided, yes, we will implement that in the future. And Alex, who is himself a lawyer, said that can't be done retrospectively. McDougall, who was a former Attorney General, disagreed and said it can. And White said, no, that's Michael Chalsey's arm. You cannot do that retrospectively. My view on that is, if you could do it for nursing home charges, why can't you do it for? Why can you not do it?
And the effect of applying that retrospectively would be
the effect would be that some people would have to divest themselves and would decide what they want to be. They would have to decide whether they want to concentrate on newspapers, whether they concentrate on print. It is linked, or some people seem to think it's linked to property rights, and that there may be a constitutional issue there. It's one of the referendums I wouldn't have a problem with. I think the public would be comfortable enough with trying to divest some people of shares.
So just in relation to the radio issue, you were saying that under the terms in which radio licenses are issued, it's quite possible to say we won't give a license to somebody who already has other media interests above a certain threshold.
You could prescribe those.
Okay, and I think, Tom, the thing is, we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not trying to invent the wheel here. This is found elsewhere, isn't it, in the world? There are various safeguards in place that try to prevent concentration of ownership. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, and I should start by saying that. I don't agree entirely with Seamus on the law can be applied retrospectively. I'm probably more circumspect than that. I'm not sure that you can apply that law retrospectively without ending up in a long litigation. A much easier way to, if a government chose to do this, and then they come back to that in a second, a much easier way is Seamus' second point, which is every local radio station in the country operates on a 10-year franchise. Those licenses come up. Live 95 is due up very soon. That at any stage can be changed. You can simply say all new licenses from now on must meet X and Y requirements. So it would be very easy to do it in that way, and I think probably a much better way to approach it. I'm not sure that changing the law and trying to apply it retrospectively is actually going to work. But let me come back to the bigger point. Given the current state of the lack of government we have, I still think that all governments are afraid of tackling men who buy ink by the barrel, if I can quote James. I think that, and let's be honest about it here, we're talking about Dennis O'Brien, there's no point dancing around the issue. Dennis O'Brien is a billionaire, he's one of the most powerful men in the country, and people are afraid of him. It's as simple as that. He owns, or his company owns 29% of INM, Independent News and Media, and he owns Community Corp. Combined, that's quite a chunk of the Irish media market. I would say I'm not as troubled about him owning all of that as perhaps some of my colleagues are, particularly with local radio, because local radio and broadcasting in Ireland is incredibly controlled. The legislation that the BAI prescribe around elections, Bryan, as you know yourself, you're counting by the second. Anyone who listens to news talk, for example, in the morning, or any time during the day, to be honest, I don't think you can say that Dennis is on the phone every 10 seconds saying, I want you to cover X and Y and Z. I'm not sure he is. I don't think he is. I think there's a different issue with independent news and media. The independent papers, and I used to work for them. What's happened with the independent papers, I left the Irish Independent 10 years ago this year. I was one of the first journalists to leave when Jerry Regan was appointed, for different reasons. But I worked for the Independent at a time when being a journalist of the Independent, like being elected a TD, the power you had was extraordinary. Everybody wanted to talk to you. The Irish Independent sold 170,000 copies every day, and they weren't books, they were real copies. It had huge power, and it behaved responsibly. The editor was a great man, Vinnie Doyle. He had lots of problems as well. I'm sure Seamus will tell. He, like all editors, he had pluses and minuses. And there was interference. There's no point saying there wasn't. It was owned by Tony O'Reilly, the Bean Baron, Tony O'Reilly, Sir Anthony O'Reilly, AJF O'Reilly, call it what you like. Occasionally, through his PR company, certainly did issue diktat around how he wanted it to be referred to. That happened. And bizarrely enough, occasionally, certain prize winnings of prize heifers, pictures appeared in the paper, this kind of stuff.
Probably fairly minor stuff.
Well, it was fairly minor stuff. I think that's changed dramatically. I think the sacking of, I think Sam Smith, I'm not saying he was sacked, Sam Smith leaving the Independent, the man who reported on all of the issues around the granting of the ESAD licence, Jim O'Doherty leaving the Independent, Anne Harris leaving the Independent, the list goes on. I'm not for a second saying that I was fit to wipe any of their feet, I wasn't. I was a junior reporter and I left many years ago. But I think a lot of journalists who I respect and who I value have left, and they've left under, most of them have spoken about the reasons they've left, and they've certainly questioned whether or not they were free to operate in the newsroom in the way that we would expect journalists to be free.
I think you want to go on this.
About the idea of interference, it's obviously very difficult to prove because people won't talk about it so much, but I think one thing we have to think about, not think of politics solely as elections, because obviously there's strict rules around electoral processes, but there's a lot more to politics than elections. And cross-ownership also goes across the media. To give the more obvious example, which we'll be talking about later, is the water charges thing. Now, Dennis O'Brien had a huge interest in water. He owned the meters, he supplied the meters, so you had this big mass movement going on. And there's no rules in the BAI about giving protesters a voice, giving police a voice, etc. And the framing of that O'Deverell will be talking about is incredible. I mean, really, I won't go into too much of it now, but I'll just give one small example. On the 30th of May, 2015, the Irish Times, Daily Mail and Examiner all had front pages in CiteServe. This is the height of the Captain Murphy thing when it wasn't being done. All of them, front pages, CiteServe, CiteServe, CiteServe. Now, guess where it was in the Indo? Page 22. Tiny little thing like that. Their front pages that kind of attack public service workers. That now, did Dennis O'Brien ring up the editor and go, "You don't do this"? Probably not. Hiring policies. You know, Dennis will, or whoever does the hiring, will hire people that they know will play ball correctly. So it's hugely important. And then on all issues, I also had a lovely quote from Frank Connolly had in the Daily Ireland, if you remember that newspaper, short-lived newspaper back in early 2000s. And he got a quote from Tony O'Reilly that he gave to Forbes magazine. And he was asked in 1983 by Forbes, how did he get access to all that oil and all that gas beds? And he basically said, this is a direct quote, "Since I own 35% of the newspapers in Ireland, I have close contact with politicians. I got the blocks I wanted. That's how." And that's from the horse's mouth. So this idea of power, it's much deeper. You know, it's about creating ideologies, creating realities, and backroom power. You know, this doesn't make the newspapers. It only got into Forbes in 1983, and luckily Frank Connolly looked it up. So the issue of politics and power is beyond elections. You know, it's beyond stopwatches, and I think that's very important to keep accounted, to keep an eye on it. And O'Brien, we always end up talking about him, is that hugely powerful person in lots of different areas. And, you know, we won't even have to talk about how he got where he is today. And then even, you know, when you look at Facebook and Google and all of these big, which are big news, they're big media companies now. They're now news-producing companies. And what's their position here? You know.
Well, when we talk about concentration of ownership, sometimes I think that's Dennis O'Brien ringing Stephen Ray telling him what to appear in the paper tomorrow. Now, that may or may not happen. I can certainly remember Tony O'Reilly's pressman ringing, asking why we didn't use the title Sir. But it's happening. So when I talk about the challenges of ownership, it's about those who own the media, what priorities they set and how we look at it. If Ger Colleran was here, and I'm going to pretend to be Ger for a moment, he would say that all of this is nonsense, that he doesn't worry about the role of democracy, journalism and democracy. I've had this debate with him before, and that he actually worries about people who worry about that. Because his view is that media is controlled by the market, the people decide, and what's the bother. And if you want, and I think that is a view. And
it's a deeply divisive issue, and it would be very wrong for any newspaper, I think, not to cover the issue.
Okay.
Of course, to cover the issue.
Henry, you give in on that.
Just to come in quickly on that, it wasn't covered. For months there was things going on in the estates all over the country, and until we had that big march of 100,000, it really wasn't covered. Secondly, the key point about the water charters isn't whether they're right or wrong. The key point is that the entire movement is framed as being violent. And now I don't want to ruin Owen's presentation later because he's going to talk about this in more depth.
But there were, I mean, the question, but there were violent issues.
There was hundreds of thousands of people marching.
There weren't.
There weren't.
Yes, there were.
We can't hear you. One voice.
Okay. I saw clips on YouTube, RT covered them, lots of organisations covered issues of incidents of violence.
Okay.
We have people before the courts right now, and I certainly don't want to in any way prejudice any court case, but it's not true. It's not true to say there were not issues of violence.
I'm hesitant to kind of prolong, but just bear with me, because this is going to be discussed. I think Owen is going to make a presentation later, and it's clearly going to be a lively exchange of views on it. And I don't want to take the wind out of his sails. I mean, I'd like to hear what Henry said. Do you want to say something quickly, Owen, on this? And then I'll come to you on it. Yeah?
I'll talk a lot of detail about this later on, but there are huge issues around source bias, the over-reliance on Gardaí in terms of supplying figures as to the extent of protests, and there's also a question for students of journalism and journalists around, question about democracy. So when people protest, there is a requirement that the coverage of protesters be fair and balanced and engage critically with the dynamics behind that protest.
Yeah, just briefly, was media ownership a factor in all of this, do you believe?
Yes.
To isolate that?
Yes, it was.
In what respect?
I think, as Henry has already pointed out, there are some particularly problematic kinds of coverage in the independent media group and the news talk in relation to this.
Because you think there was conflicts of interest?
I think ultimately you cannot divorce these things when you have such a convergence in terms of ownership. And I talk about it more.
Okay, fair, that's right.
I think there's deeper ideological issues within this, because the kind of reporting and protest has been decades of research into it. And on the matter to be objective and factual, I mean, there was marches of hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands, on a regular basis, and there was no, I mean, there just wasn't. And if we talk about a sit-down protest in front of a car as violence, I don't think it's violent. I think it's a sit-down protest. Yeah, but that's my opinion. But I don't think to categorise something like that. And now here we go into media and power. You know, there's children, actual children, facing court cases over that sit-down protest, and it was blown out of proportion in the most amazing. I've never seen anything like it. He was sat down in front of. This is fairly normal. This isn't a big deal. You know, there wasn't a riot. I think in the entire couple of years of the water protest, a single brick was thrown. One, okay. You know, I mean, and that is, compare that to pretty much any country in Europe, and you will find that, and even within that, we're talking not that long ago, there were bombs going on. You know, I watch people like Pat Rabbit talk about, oh my God, politics has gotten so violent. It hasn't. It's actually, you know, it's not violent. It's anything but.
Okay, I think it's producing good journalism on a not-for-profit basis, funded by philanthropy. And so I think those are the kind of models that you can see. And then just finally, Bryan, universities have a role to play. Right across the US, journalism schools have in the last 10 years worked with local newsrooms, with local newspapers, with local radio, and moved on campus where there's been a sharing of journalism students and facilities to fund not-for-profit initiatives, hyper-locals, which effectively are what we would consider local newspapers and local radio. So it doesn't have to be owned by very wealthy individuals or big groups. There are other ways of doing that. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's possible.
Yeah, it's a pie in the sky, Seamus.
I don't think it's pie in the sky, and I'm familiar with some of the hyper-locals. I'm familiar with the Carnegie Trust actually had a local media initiative. I was on the panel for that, where they funded what are essentially local community newsletters. I don't believe that will ever replace your commercial media, but it's a platform for outside voices. I would, however, of course, say that, and here I want to declare an instance, I'm a director of Glen, which actually has been funded by philanthropies. But don't believe for a moment that that's not agenda driven. I just happen to agree with your PD's agenda. Philanthropists do have an agenda. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with that, that's the struggle for journalism always, is to make sure that where there is an agenda, that the agenda is clear. And that goes not just in terms of the media organisation, but when you're interviewing people. One of my criticisms during the whole Celtic Tiger era was that you could listen to Morning Ireland, you could listen to News Talk, you could pick up the Indo, and you had these learned economists telling us what they were doing, but not declaring that they had sat on the board of banks, that they had sat on and you still have it. I mean, I know we all probably know, but if we are being inflicted with Shane Ross every Sunday, we should actually read at the bottom of it that he is an independent TD, in both senses. And so I think that it's about knowing what the agenda is. Commercial media will always exist. They will have an agenda apart from making money, but it's making the agenda clear, and it's making the vested interest clear. I have no problem with people declaring an opinion, but I do think I'm entitled to know where they're coming from.
Yeah, okay.
Which has been very rare in this country over the very recent times, where you have what can only be described as a mass movement against the general discourse of politics and commerce in Ireland, which was very much around the water charges kind of thing. And I'm not going to go into that, but I would just like to say that the point was made about violence and so on, and whether that was covered. It's not a matter of whether it was covered. Of course it was covered. It's a matter of how it was covered. And for example, the instance of Jonestown and the so-called violence there, where people, as somebody said, sat down or whatever. And if you think about it, what the media in general, and I wouldn't pick out commercial radio particularly in relation to that, or commercial interest, RTE, is just disgraceful. absolutely disgraceful in its conduct of journalism in relation to that whole campaign. But, for example, a couple of years ago, when Michael Noonan had pie thrown in his face during the election campaign, now that could very well have been described as a violent action, and a lot more violent than sitting down in front of a car in front of people who were protected by so many guards you couldn't see them through them. But that was taken up by the media as hilarious, funny. Why? Because Michael Noonan described it as funny. I usually have my chips before my pie, kind of stuff. And that was the statement he made. But because he framed it in those terms, the media followed on. Because the politicians framed the Jonestown peaceful protest as a violent one, the media, across the board almost, continued in the same way. And that is what they do every single day. And, RTE presents itself as being, different from the commercial interest, and unfortunately, in recent years, it really, really isn't.
Thank you for that. So maybe over here, and then I think here at the front. So, sorry, somebody there, just we're working your way around the room, yes. Actually, no, maybe you might introduce yourself briefly if you're a student or if you're,
Amelia Ryan, journalism student here in UL. We've talked a lot about media ownership and talked about commercial media ownership. But in non-commercial media ownership, particularly in local radio stations or the community radio stations, they can also have agendas, pardon me, and they can, as Henry talked about, non-seen agendas, whereby they're usually community-owned with share ownership in it. But that can also be a core group. And a lot of our stations around the country are like that. If you look in at the actual share ownership, they have certain political agendas or maybe item agendas as well. I think that's something that needs also to be looked. We all don't talk about commercial stations, but a lot of people in local areas are tuning into community stations, and they can be very much agenda setting and framing issues in a certain way also.
Yeah, I suppose the issue is that transfer. Is that on the tin? So you know what you're getting.
I don't believe it is. I don't believe it is. I think that the term community means everyone. It is termed in a state which consider everybody, and I think actually for management and board levels down, it can be very structured and very framed.
For not-for-profit, there's no ostensible commercial interest.
And there is specific regulations in the AI, but there can be agenda setting there as well.
Okay, and I think there's somebody they're gone.
Just because I work in a community station.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, I'll come across to you, yeah. Sorry, the microphone's working, so I overdo it.
Sorry, it's just because I actually I do work in a community radio station, but take a bit of time out to go back to college. But insofar as community radio stations being agenda driven, for the most part, yeah, sometimes you do get a core of people, but that's actually less down to trying to do an agenda and more down to nobody volunteering to get part of the steering committees, no one turning up and voicing other opinions. So what am I seeing at times that community stations can be agenda driven? It's not so much an intention so much as an accident, because no one's willing to step up and kind of voice a different opinion. And as a result, something similar to when you have kind of a concentration of ownership. While I don't agree with that, I do admit that sometimes it's less concentration of ownership and more a case of nobody else moving forward to take that kind of responsibility and to set those kind of standards. There is stuff in place to try and regulate these things when it comes to AI, but for the most part, as far as agendas go, it's less about agendas and more about what people are actually able to voice what they have to say.
Okay, now, definitely the same in the corner, which is again, just like give us your name.
I'm Darren from Dublin Inquirer, and started off as a blogger. Firstly, just to address a few of the points there, like violence out in Dobson. It was probably because it was in Dobson rather than how John Putin reacted, as in like Carrick Mines showed us that like when you're setting up a barricade to protect property prices, it's not violence, it's only violence, if you're economically not so powerful, then you're automatically considered violence. And this is, the trust in media and the crisis that we're having at the moment in journalism, so much of it is about that. It's about, the point that Henry raised there that, what the Independent finished, because I said, like, that's, you know, like, obviously, Dennis O'Brien, redacted, whatever, he didn't ring up and say, don't publish that on the front page. You know, that's self-censorship, it's, you know, it's cultural, and it's a natural human reaction, like, that's just people, that's how we behave, and, you know, we stereotype each other, we take the easy way out, there is a lack of diversity of voices, but there's voices like yourself who've come out of wider protest, and who are being encouraged by, you know, people here and there, like, and we are, but at the same time, like, there is kind of an ups and down situation, which is leading to a lack of trust in the media. So, where it might be uncomfortable for someone like me to stand, like, to tell you guys that, to us, you're the establishment. Do you know what I mean? Like, we're trying to get our stories across to you, and without them being framed in a nasty way. So it's like, you know, ideological domination, you know, it also comes with, you know, this, like, this belief that everything that happens is, like, we all active individual agency, whereas that's not the case. We're effectively everything around us. And really what we need to look at is the culture of journalism, not just of journalism, but, you know, really psychology. We need a revolution in psychology.
We're on courts all day long. You need professional journalism, and you need funded journalism to do that. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be privately funded or owned by people. There's lots of different models. The state model, which has its own pressures from politics, and some people would argue RT is run as a commercial enterprise anyway, you know, in some of the management skills, which is a deeper ideological problem. But there are other ones. In some of the Nordic countries, they have a thing called third tier funding, where there's taxation on the mass media, and then that goes into the fund, and then that fund will fund subscribe newspapers, and that's worked quite well there. The Canadians have quite a similar thing as well. So there are models out there, but at the same time, I think we shouldn't be. We just have to keep an eye out. And like, on the one hand, the internet is very democratizing, but on the other hand, there's still control issues there.
I think at the frontier, yes.
Sorry, Bryan.
Yeah, no, I'm going to see because I'm just up against time, so I want to let everybody in. And this is very brief, 2 sentences.
Very brief, yeah. Do you know why you just had an interest in the university? Is there any interest yet?
Do I have any other interests aside from the university? No, I don't have any other interests. No.
Oh, okay.
Well, I'm not sure what to be my interests. I'm interested in various things, but I've no interest in a declared interest sense. No. Yeah.
Speaking of interest, I have declared interest in being one of the politicians who I believe that any proper journalist should be holding to account. And I welcome the comments of Gemma earlier on saying that is the duty of any journalist to hold the politicians to account. Just in relation to 2 points and putting it out to the panel, the media plurality report that came out earlier, one of the things that struck me, which was news to me really, was around that the Broadcasting Authority does not routinely monitor the media coverage, and that it only is reactionary to complaints. That's not true.
The Broadcasting Authority, Bryan, regularly monitors. They would send an application to us when we would have to send it perhaps 3 hours of broadcast. They would ask to measure what we are producing against what is in our contract, and that's done on a very regular basis.
In terms of bias and political agendas, and it only reacts. This is in the report now. As I said, it was news to me. It was in Roddy Flynn's report that went to Europe and was just released there, saying that the Broadcasting Authority reacts to complaints and doesn't, I suppose, proactively look at bias and agendas. As I said,
I don't know, is it realistic to expect that any authority could look at every news bulletin and
well, I'm putting this out, I'm being let me finish the question, okay, because the point I'm putting it out there because it was news to me. If you disagree, then that's why I'm asking the question.
The Broadcasting Authority, as I understand it, they monitor because of the licensing authority, so they monitor.
But I think the issue is bias or
complaints. If they respond to complaints, they don't initiate investigations themselves of specific broadcasts. I think that's fair.
my understanding.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
And the second issue was, I suppose, around diversity of voices, and we were criticised in that. And obviously, we do cater for the Irish language, but we don't cater for the smaller ethnic communities that are in And I'd like to hear the panel's opinion on that, because just an example to, I suppose, the difference in media coverage. I mean, lots of people are talking about the water charges, but the Cologne attacks, which were rightly horrific, what happened on New Year's Eve in Cologne, were covered across both the state broadcaster, all of the newspapers. Yet, and lots of opinion pieces about how Islam, and it's part of the culture about being anti-women. And then we've had 2 stories break about the UN and sex abuse scandals and human trafficking. And we don't hear the same level of abuse, and these are predominantly, I suppose, white Christian men. So I'd like to see, do you mean, what is the responsibility of the news outlets? Because you're feeding into what is growing Islamophobia, and is there a responsibility on it? And would, I suppose, diversity of voices be, I suppose, challenge that? If we had more people from different communities represented, they'd be, I suppose, a stop or a barrier to it. But it was just something that really struck me, was the coverage of those 2 stories, and I suppose the broader implications they have in framing an opinion within the wider community.
It's Lynn Boyle, by the way, so who's MEP, Sinn Féin MEP, so thank you. Just actually, one of the interesting aspects of Cologne was that there was a lot of criticism of the German media, including the German national state-owned broadcaster, for not covering the Cologne attacks until a couple of days afterwards. And they took a lot of flack for that, and media were regarded as trying to play it down. Is that a lot of the criticism of the time?
It was, yeah. And just very briefly, Lynn, I'm not having a record, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just not sure that any regulator could initiate an investigation into a complaint before there was a complaint. I think you can only react to complaints once you get them. I'm not sure it works the other way around, but that's it. But yeah, I know I don't want to get into that issue per se, but
to licensing, as Tom raised the point earlier, in ensuring that there isn't cross-ownership between print and media.
Seamus, and we're particularly for people who are hoping to enter the profession in the next few years.
Well, I think, first of all, my single stand purpose speech is that we do need some kind of commission which tries to bring all of those issues together. I'm glad Lynn mentioned international coverage, because this had been a very parochial discussion. One of the big problems actually is that news desks, there are very few national print media who cover international stories. Anytime anyone, RTE sends people abroad, print media attack them for sending them on junkets. Advice spectrum is important in the industry. It is a hugely dynamic industry. It will exist, it will change. What I would say is join the NUJ, get involved in the NUJ, and campaign within the NUJ for improvements in your workplace. Because quite bluntly, if you won't stand up for your own terms and conditions of employment, you're unlikely to be in a position to call power to account for other people. And join the NUJ as a student member, www.nuj.org.
That's the one plug. Tom, a final word to you on this.
Yeah, if I could be positive, about 5 years ago or 6 years ago in this room we had a conference on local newspapers, and at the time it wasn't looking all that healthy for them. And they've survived, and they're just starting now to come out of recession. I think digital offers a huge opportunity for media, and we're certainly not quite there yet. But there are going to be opportunities for young journalists coming out of journalism schools, and there is going to be diversity offered by a range of digital platforms, digital media platforms. I think that's where the diversity is going today. We're seeing print circulation dropping all the time among national newspapers. And we've seen something like a journal come from nowhere to be a really interesting voice and a different kind of voice, and offering a different platform for different voices. And so I do think there's diversity around digital. And I think if you want to work in journalism in the future, digital skills are absolutely important. Understand social media, understand data journalism, and be multimedia proficient. Be the virtual unicorn. And any good news editor looking to hire are looking for those kinds of skills.
Okay, I'm going to give Tom the last word because I've just overrun and draw to a conclusion. And I thank Henry, Gillian, Seamus.